But when I was asked to introduce Karen, then I thought, well, I was once provided very wise advice to do one thing each day that risks you getting fired. And so I thought, this is a great time to play with that, isn't it? And so instead of just giving Karen a boring introduction, I thought I'd write a poem. And so this is a poem that I've written about Karen. To what might I compare my good friend Karen? Perhaps she's like an apple tree in bloom. The life of birds and fruit and insects wild bring out the best when she enters a room. Her kindness and compassion, like a child, create a spark that catches those in gloom and shines a light to others all around. Might lift their eyes to dream that they might bloom. And when she knows that better might be found, she challenges what others might assume, building an air of safety in the ground, unleashing direct feedback over Zoom. So maybe not an apple tree in truth, refreshing rain perhaps, or mighty glacier. Whatever metaphor, please raise the roof for my friend Karen, a real force of nature.
Wow. How do you follow that? Thanks, Sam. You are remarkable. For those of you who don't know Sam, please, by all means, do look him up. He is a force of nature. Welcome, everybody. It's so great to see you all on Zoom today. Whatever time of year it is with you, whatever time of day it is with you, just wanted to say welcome. A bit about me before we get started, just so you know, I guess my creds, and indeed I'll just pass back to Sam as well, just to give you a sense of what he does as well. We both work for an organisation called Thornton, that's a business that's in accounting, tax, advisory work, and a global business. We actually both work within the board and governance advisory practice. So although we are both qualified coaches, our work is very much determined in two ways. Sam focuses primarily on coaching and I focus primarily on board evaluations and looking at skills of leadership and governance. And by focusing on that, we try and bring a developmental lens to something that is actually a regulated activity and is something that is not valued. So just by bringing a coaching mindset to something that is regarded as a compliance exercise can, as you, I'm sure all of you know, can just transform the energy in a room. I've been coaching for 30 years now, do a lot of group coaching, work with leaders to help them to drive change and actually help cultures also develop from the grassroots up. My genuine love is one-to-one coaching and group coaching, and I'm proud to be a member of the EMCC because I believe we do some really great work around development for our coaches. But Sam, just a quick word from you before we get started.
Okay, hi everyone. Yeah, my name is Sam Isaacson. I lead our coaching services offering from Grant Thornton. I also play roles in the wider coaching world. So I sit on an advisory board for the ICF, and as part of our EQA program, then I am responsible for recommending individuals for accreditation. And I chaired the Trailblazer group of employers that led the development of the new coaching professional apprenticeship, which went live last year. And I have a book coming out this year on coaching with technology, so everybody should buy that. But yeah, Karen and I work closely together on the coaching work that we deliver, delivery of coaching, coach development, and advice to organizations about as well. Thanks, Karen.
Thanks, Sam. Just absolutely great to see you and welcome. This is quite an interesting, and I sometimes find as a coach, quite a challenging environment to be working in. Imposter syndrome is something that we've heard about for many years. There was research that was started as early as 1978, and yet there isn't a great deal that actually informs our thinking as coaches as to what can we do to help our coachees move on from imposter syndrome, and indeed what actually is it, because it's that classic situation of once we know the unknown, we can start to deal with it and manifest it. So for the next sort of 65, 70 minutes or so, we're going to be spending time exploring what is imposter syndrome, why does it happen, and really to hold our hands up and say, I've been there, and actually as a coach I need to manage my internal dialogue to ensure that I'm not creating unconscious bias or transference of any sort when actually coaching others around imposter syndrome. I thought we'd look at 3 areas. I think the first thing, as I said to you, is what is it? And why is it that it manifests leaders? What are leaders dealing with? Is it a female thing versus a male thing? Is it some way connected to diversity and inclusion? What actually is it and what manifests it? And once we've elicited that understanding for ourselves as coaches, we can then sort of go on to thinking about, if we understand it and we understand how to elicit insights for our coach, what tools have we got in our toolbox to help to move the coachee on? And the third thing is looking at those tools, giving you some of those tools, some of the ones that I've used and I've been gifted over the years, to get your thoughts really on what works for you. And I really encourage you through this session to be interactive. I think this is a subject particularly that there isn't much on in terms of research, and we can share together in terms of what you find works particularly well for you when you're working with coaches from all levels of the organisation, not just leaders. Okay, before we go any further, just to say to you, I ran this session originally back in November. And I don't know about if it's the same for you, but I found myself positioning my thinking in how things are changing from certain chunks of lockdown. Here in the UK, we've had, I think we've had 3, we're threatening a 4th, but I think we're going to bypass it. But it has been very much a time of learning for many leaders. I think leaders, we would all say, have learned a lot in the last year. They've learned to become more authentic selves. They've felt able to be more honest and transparent. And only last week, the Glassdoor Global and UK, what will we call it, sort of the list of the top organisations and top CEOs was published. And 2 things struck me. One was that having had a female CEO previously with Grant Thornton, we supported her. We thought she was a real champion out in the market, but wasn't doing the work she needed to be doing internally to really bring the partnership community along with her. Our CEO for the last 3 years has been a guy called David Dunkley. He sits at number 46 in the UK list, and he's been an inspiring leader. He's learned to be more transparent, to be honest where he can be honest, and to speak regularly to us within the organisation. I don't know if you're hearing this as coaches. I'd love to hear the stories that you have. But the other thing that struck me, which was a shock when I looked at that same list of the UK top CEOs, was only 1 out of those 50 CEOs was a woman. And she is the chair, or rather the CEO of the British Heart Foundation. She's at number 4. And it got me questioning, how does this connect with imposter syndrome? Because the one thing we know about imposter syndrome is that when the research was started back in '78 and papers were being written, it was a belief that imposter syndrome struck women more than men, that it actually was something that manifested in women, and particularly female high achievers. That's not proved to be the case. We'll look at that later on. Let's just start to dig into this a bit more. So I'm going to show you 2 things. One is the official version, and one is the SAM version that you found off the internet, which I love. Imposter syndrome is a psychological pattern in which an individual doubts their skills, talents, or accomplishments, and has a persistent internalized fear of being exposed as a fraud. I don't know if this is ringing any bells for you. It's definitely for me. Despite external evidence of their competence, those experiencing this phenomenon remain convinced that they are frauds, and they do not deserve all they have achieved. Individuals with imposterism incorrectly attribute their success to luck or interpret it as a result of deceiving others into thinking they're more intelligent than they perceive themselves to be. And as I said to you, while early research focused on the prevalence amongst high-achieving women, imposter syndrome is now seen as recognised to affect both men and women almost equally. So this is the official version, and I think it rings a bell. We're going to unpack that a bit further in a few minutes. So I'd like to show you something that you'll be able to click on yourselves when you have some time. This is a lovely little piece that Sam found. Do you suffer from imposter syndrome? And if you scroll down just a bit, thanks, Nicola, you can see there's this lovely flow chart. Various different manifestations of why you have or you haven't got imposter syndrome. So I'd really encourage you to take a look at it. But what is really valuable is at the very bottom there is helpful learning. And at the very bottom sits 5 different personas that manifest as imposter syndrome. You can read those. I won't read them out to you. And I just, you know, I'm going to ask you in a moment to identify if you've ever had imposter syndrome, but I just wonder if any of those personas resonate for you. If I'm being honest, I am a mix of perfectionist, which probably drives Sam around the bend sometimes, and I set possibly high standards for myself and keep beating myself up when I don't reach them. But I also am a soloist. I believe work must be accomplished alone and refuse to take credit if I receive any kind of assistance. I think that's a little bit brutal. I would say that I find it easy to work alone. I have to work on, and have been doing this all my career, working effectively with teams. Because that's part of the work that I do, both in the organisation and with my external clients. But being an only child, I am naturally a soloist. I was brought up, went to boarding school, and lots of our experiences in childhood drive imposter syndrome. We'll look at that a little bit later. So I'm going to ask you in a minute to carry out our first poll. But I'm just wondering, really, do these 5 personas, do they sort of, if you can just give me a nod, can you give me any sense of recognition for yourself in any of those? Yes, I'm saying, yeah, a few people say yes. I wonder where the natural geniuses are, or is it genii? I don't know. Anyway, Nicola, I wonder if we can launch the first poll. Let's see, let's start by getting to see people in the room and get to understand how you feel for yourself. So the question is, how often do you personally feel like an imposter? Thinks about it, isn't it? Terrific. Thank you for your honesty. The question is, how often do we feel like an imposter? And the reality is, for most of us, occasionally. And you know, as coaches, there's valuable information for us to work with from the very start. What does occasionally mean to you? When is occasionally? What are the environments that prompt that occasional manifestation? Rarely, again, just working on this knowledge that we have around where are you on this scale and what is manifesting it, because once we understand that, we can move forward. What I would say is that a lot of the research is saying around 70% of us have struggled with imposter syndrome over the years. And I always think the other 30% are probably in self-denial anyway, or either that or just so full of their own self-belief and perhaps some self-importance as to why they would ever have to worry about what other people thought about them. But thanks, Nicola, that's really, really helpful. So let's move on to the next slide and really get going on the content to understand what imposter syndrome is. Well, I think the first thing to say is, where does it come from and how does it manifest? It is there to protect us. I just wonder, just open up the lines if anybody's got any thoughts about where imposter syndrome is, what it is and how it manifests. First of all, what actually is it? Does anybody want to take the mic at all?
So it's beliefs that I founded when I was a small girl from things that my parents said or my teachers said that I internalized, tried to make sense of, but when I was little, I didn't do it very well, and so I'm still sort of hanging on to those today, and they're not helping me as an adult because they weren't I didn't create them for me to use as an adult.
Yeah. Paula, thank you so much for that. Absolutely spot on. So much of what we experience in our childhood, we haven't got the tools and the strategies to make sense of. So those, the impact of that learning and the repeated use of that in terms of identifying situations where we need to protect ourselves, situations of extreme stress, where we haven't got the strategies as children to deal with things that actually keep us safe, means that actually immediately in our subconscious, those are the things that pop up. And it is that subconscious reaction, as we know, that creates fight, flight, freeze. It is that whole subliminal learning, that less than conscious self, that doesn't really manifest in words, but actually manifests in feelings and physiology, changes in physiology that generate this change. And it only takes our pulse rate to go up by 5 beats per minute for us immediately to get into fight, flight and freeze. What does that actually mean? It means that there is more adrenaline rushing around the body. It means that we're driven with energy to fight or to run. And at the same time, the more we get into that state, the more our cortisol in our brains lock us down. And therefore, some of us actually find we're unable to speak out. That actually happened to me. I was coaching somebody yesterday afternoon, and she was talking about this very thing. She's just been made a director. She's doing the same job really as she was doing before, but for a different community, a more senior community. And she couldn't explain what was happening to her when she was having to present. She couldn't explain the feelings that she was experiencing, the anxiety she was experiencing, the self-doubt she was experiencing before going on. She could see the slides getting closer and closer to her, and she got more and more panicky. So we did some work on her subconscious, her less conscious self, first of all, and managing that fight, flight, freeze reaction. But I know some of you have made a comment about, are we in danger of giving a label of imposter syndrome to something that is purely anxiety? Absolutely agree. What is the difference? Anxiety or stress is very often attributed to a certain situation, and if we repeat that situation and we don't learn to move on, we are not driven to move on and learn and change and reframe, then it quickly becomes something that's a phenomenon that's within us. It's created neural pathways. And we tend to repeat the same sense of reaction. So the physiology, the neurology changes that take place that create the voice. Where is the voice coming from? Well, it's definitely not from our subconscious, because that's not where words reside. It's in our conscious neocortex, which is predominantly articulating and creating narrative around situations where we're under threat. And we're going to do some work on that in a little bit later. But for now, let's just move on to the next slide, if we may, and look at what we're talking about, the triggers. We're going to open up into groups in a moment, but I'm going to give you some thoughts before that around what you see as the triggers around imposterism. And the differences really between those triggers, which we've already started to unpack, and the triggers to do with anxiety and self-doubt. What I would say to you is this: the first thing that a lot of people think about when they're thinking around doubting myself, I haven't got the confidence to do this, is that everybody else in the room knows more than me. And actually helping our coachees to understand what the word reality means, and to help them to unpack their belief systems versus what is reality, is really very, very helpful. To start to really challenge the language with imposter syndrome is hugely important. I find actually the expressions, the general generalizations that are given. I always do this in that situation. I am never confident. I can hear this voice. This voice always manifests just about before I go on and start presenting. When we start to challenge those generalizations and allow people to really unpack the reality that sits below, then we can start to do some good work. We have to, as coaches, move beneath the surface to look at what the values and beliefs are, what the experiences are, without getting into that dangerous territory of over unpacking childhood experience. We do need to ensure that our coachee, our team member, whatever it may be, whoever that may be, understands that what their experience is not reality. Okay, if you'd like to go into a chat room now, we're going to take 10 minutes out in this session to just explore this a bit more. And do feel free to open up this conversation the way you see fit. I'm interested to hear about what triggers you see and sense as imposterism, but also what other experiences you've had personally and when coaching others. That would be really helpful. And when you come back into the room, when you get called back into the room, you're going to have a minute just to record your thoughts in the chat. And then Sam's going to summarise up that feedback from you. So, Nicola, thanks very much indeed. And I'll see you in 10 minutes. Hi, welcome back, everyone. Have you just, if you haven't already done so, please take a few minutes, or a minute I should say, just to capture your thoughts and what really resonated for you from the conversations that you've just been a part of. And Sam's going to draw those together in themes and pick out any spiky differences that might be useful to share.
Yeah, I'll just leave a minute of silence for you to just stick your thoughts into that chat room, and then I'll pull them together. Please do keep dropping your thoughts into the chat. I'll just highlight a couple of the themes that seem to be coming out for me. There's a bit of a talk in there around external influences that contribute towards us getting getting this sense of having an imposter syndrome. Some of that to do with having an interview that then sets you up to believe that you have to be better than you are because it's within your best hour when you get given that job, and then suddenly when you're there, then you must be underperforming. Really encouraging conversations around the connections that have been made in those groups and a sense of not being on our own, and that we all feel this way. That's positive. And also, I think it's important to pull out this continuum idea between low sense of self-doubt at one end and really dysfunctional medical issue of imposter syndrome at the other, and the importance of coaching and the opportunities that we have as coaches to be able to serve people in this way. And I'll just finish with this final reframe question that I think looks like it could be helpful. What don't I want to lose if I manage my imposter syndrome better? Which is always a good challenge.
Can you repeat the question again, please?
What don't you want to lose by managing your imposter syndrome better?
Thanks, Sam, very much indeed. That was really helpful. And it's great to know that Sam and I, we're all working together with people who've got an extended exposure to this sort of stuff. We're working with different people within our own firm. We've only just very, very recently created 2 levels of development programs particularly for women. A director and moving towards partner levels. And one of the things that as a group coach on that program, I experience regularly is women at the highest level saying, look, I just don't feel worthy of this work. I don't feel valued. We're also doing some work around Black women fast achievers, fast movers, and how they particularly are struggling with this whole concept of feeling fit, as if they don't fit into society, as corporate society as we know it in the Western world. And we've still got a long way to go. Let's face it, we've still got a long way to go in ensuring that our working environments are conducive to allow everybody to show up and bring the best of themselves. It reminds me of a story I was telling last time I was with a group of people from EMCC at the conference, talking about a guy I was coaching who'd just become another director in an organisation, and how imposter syndrome was manifesting for him. His anxiety, his self-doubt was manifesting for him, and he was really one of the first senior male leaders who came over so strong, so confident, so on his game, that had allowed that trust to develop within our coaching interventions to really start to unpack it and recognize that he wanted to. And one of the most meaningful moments for me when he was talking about how it manifested for him were 2 things he said, which I found brutally honest. One was, the more loud the noise in my ear, the more directive and aggressive I become in the working environment. And the louder the voice in my ear criticizing others at my own expense, he said, the more I began to be patronizing to those same people. And he found himself to be someone he didn't like very much. And when we started to work on actually how he felt about himself and how he was dealing with the derailers, both external and intrinsic, once he started to do that work and was ready to say, I actually need to deal with this because I am not bringing the best of myself as a leader to the organisation, it's incredible to watch this manic individual calm right down and become the leader he really, really deserved to be. I'm going to read you just a couple of things before we go on to the tools. This is from Cantor Profiles, and it's actually called The Value of Knowing Your Shadow. Many of you may well know Cantor's work. But I've reframed them slightly, which I think is a really good introduction to look at the inner critic, recognising that inner voice and inner feelings. So some of the things we can do for coachees in terms of doing this work, this challenging work, and asking their permission to be able to do that is, number 1, does your coachee want to discover the deepest sources of their most unproductive, and Cantor's word, ruinous behaviours? Other words we use are derailers. Does your coachee want to look at the sources, and sometimes the deepest sources, but we have our protection zone that we know where we can work in and out and what's okay and what's not okay, to discover and understand what our most unproductive states are. Number 2, do you want to, as a coachee, do you want to liberate yourself? And that means by liberating yourself and your less than conscious self, liberate your creative energies. Or do you want to stay stuck in that wasteful state? What value is there to that is eating away at your energy, your time, your confidence? Another question that is always helpful. Do you want to diffuse these negative emotions that are spoiling your bid for success? And those negative emotions can actually block us in personal, intimate relationships, family relationships, friendships, and of course at work as well. So these are the sort of questions we can ask to really start to open this up when our coachee comes to us and saying, look, I don't trust myself. I don't believe in myself. And another thing that Cantor talks about is, do you want to get into a state where you can feel free of shame, fear, grief, and rage? Recognizing what's driving that, logically understanding it, and therefore able to reframe it into action. I love that. Are you able to feel free of shame, fear, grief, and rage by recognizing what's triggering it, naming it, and then reframing it into an action? So let's move on to the slides, and I want to now start to unpack a bit further around what are the differences between men and women in dealing with anxiety, self-belief, disbelief, and self-limiting beliefs, and also in terms of when we get this imposterism, where it manifests and where it comes from. So some of you, I'm sure, in your groups have been exploring where this all comes from. You've already mentioned that it comes from our childhood experiences, and we know, those of us who've looked into neuroscience and some of the NLP stuff, that our subconscious is learning all the time till the day we die. It's absorbing information. We know that dreams connect up, sometimes irrationally, the experiences that we've had, but at least as human beings, as adults, most of us have the tools as we increase in our ages and our experiences to logically think things through. And yet each and every one of us is driven by what happened in our childhood, and it doesn't take much for us to think about what was the most painful experience. One of the things I always do to as a little tester for whether or not we believe and trust in our neural pathways, is I tend to ask my coaching, look, okay, if you don't believe in this stuff, let's just do away with the childhood experience stuff, which we don't need to focus on. That's not part of the work we do together. But hey, just think about the last time you were, if you drink, really drunk. Where were you? What was the environment? What was the time of year? Were you inside? Were you outside? Shut your eyes now and just visualize that experience. And recognizing yourself. Are you talking from yourself? Are you observing yourself in this situation? What do you see? What do you feel? What do you hear? And then transport yourself to the next morning. And then how did you feel? How are you in that situation the next morning, or even later on that night? And every time I ask that same question, the smile comes on my coach's face and says, yeah, I know that situation. I remember it well. It was 15 years ago. It was when I was at university. Sometimes it was 6 weeks ago. The point being that our unconscious self can grab that extreme memory and lock it in to keep us safe. And that's what we're dealing with. So these are the manifestations here of the imposter syndrome. These are the things that we can suffer from. These are the inputs and the outputs. Women are slightly different to men. Women tend to express it with defendants, and that means we put a defensive container around us. We have very often people who suffer from it regularly have lower self-esteem than their colleagues. They tend to isolate. They tend to be not so playful, but driven by the need to be and prove themselves in a world that is dominated by men at higher levels in leadership. Men demonstrate it in different ways. They tend to take a less nurturing, challenging view, a softer felt experience. They tend to come out, step out, and can be more aggressive and arrogant to try and overcome what is going on internally for them. So how can we support our coachees to start to understand that dialogue? We'll just go through the next one. I want to show you this slide, and then it'd be really good just to open up the lines for, let's say 5 minutes. How are we doing for time? Not too bad. Some lovely quotes here, but it'd be really good to just share, if you would just like to share a few things around what your experiences are of helping your coachees to get to a point where they are controlling that inner voice, that critical inner voice. If you'd like to stick them on the chat, it'd be great. Sam, if you'd like to pick up anything that's coming through, that'd be great.
Yeah, again, I'll just leave it a minute for people to type what thoughts are occurring.
That's a lovely comment, Sarah, asking for evidence, really getting beneath the surface.
Yes, okay, so we got some, I guess it's back to that reframing idea. So recognizing their value system, focusing on their strengths, so looking about their achievements, developing perspective, simply asking the question, is it really true? Recognizing awareness that it is actually an issue. Questioning the facts and then asking, so what? And actively giving positive feedback. Thinking about whether you'd say that to your best friend.
Yeah, I love that.
And what choices they have. Yeah, go on.
Thanks, Sam. Thank you. Thanks, everybody. That's really helpful, and it sort of segues us really nicely into this final 15 minutes or so. So we're now going to sort of wrap this session up with some tools and some strategies that you can use. Some of them that you've already identified through your questions, through your mindsets, and helping shift mindsets for coachees, and actually the tools and models that we have. I wanted to just land on this single slide and look at the final sentence from Michelle Obama. She said, "You have a right to be exactly who you are. Don't let anybody make you feel like you don't matter." And I think what is interesting is when I work with women particularly, and I don't mean to be a feminist or indeed gender specific, but what I hear women say as coaches, I really need to work harder, I need to work longer than my male colleagues to prove myself, to get my voice in the room, I need to prove myself. Black women particularly worry, and a lot of the coaching that we do in this area is very much around actually how can you stand as a Black woman leader and deal with the different labels that women of colour have to deal with, men of colour too, but particularly women of colour who can be accused of being aggressive, dogmatic, challenging, when really there are other frames that would be used for males using that same sort of language, or indeed white female leaders. So it is an ongoing issue that we are dealing with as coaches, and we really need to be mindful of it. We need to be mindful of it simply because there is a change happening in business. Leaders right now are feeling threatened by the fact they have to go back into the office, that they have to be that person they've been on Zoom calls for 60 minutes for the whole of the day. They have to make this the new authentic them. And our role as coaches is really critical to help that leader start to populate and percolate positivity and positive thinking without it being arrogant. For men, I need to work harder on my success. I don't need to prove myself to others. Rather, I need to prove myself to myself. I need to keep proving that I can do this to myself. Different phraseology, but coming to the same conclusion. Okay, let's have a look at some models. Nicola, could you just, we're going to just rattle through a few of these. How are we doing for time, everyone? Because I am keen to open up for sort of 10 minutes at the end. I know somebody highlighted from Spain, I think, how transaction analysis has a game to play, a part to play in terms of dealing with imposterism, and I totally agree. I've known and worked with this model now for 30 years plus. I learned it first of all when I was training. I was on my certificate of training, and it stayed with me, and it can, I find, create great insights. If I just show this up on the screen to a coachee and say, I just want you to make sense of what, let's work through this and let's make some sense of it. I think the gentleman who gave us the link in Spain was talking about the pig and the witch, which is the top left-hand corner, the directive, aggressive, tell parent, or the nurturing parent, which is the witch. So she comes over as very nice on the surface, but actually she's undermining you the whole time. So this is the dialogue that is going on, that's creating imposter syndrome, coming at us from the environment. You know, the sort of thing, well, let me take that over for you, because you're obviously not getting what it is I want, and the quality of the work is really not good enough. Whereas the parent is, you're just not delivering this on time, and whether it's nurturing, whether it's directive, doesn't matter. It's critical. It's basically saying that I'm okay, you're really not okay. And then diagonally, you get the child, the passive and the manipulative child, responding to that, where that voice is, I really can't do this. This is me speaking to myself intrinsically. I can hear it. I know that I'm not going to deliver what I want. I know I sabotage myself. I do the same thing over and over again as a woman. I know that I'm slow to change, to learn, and yet I keep doing it. I keep expecting it to happen. And then there's the manipulative child that is the, well, I'm really no good at this. I can't do this. And I know I can't do it. I've done it many times before. So I'm going to go and use my network or my team to push it over to them and let them take it on. The third and bottom left-hand model, part of the model, is team, where we've all checked out, and that voice can sometimes be a voice that's saying, look, I'm just not okay about all of this stuff, and I really don't like what that person's saying in the environment and what's happening here. Don't feel the culture's right, don't feel the leadership is right, you know, and I'm just going to play along with it, but I'm actually going to be creating challenges where I need to. That teen role, which is my name for it, and I call the dysfunctional teen, is for those of you who've seen that style of teenage behaviour where they're in that departure lounge. They're not really interested in what's going on. So it is our role as coaches to perhaps help our coaches to identify that if you take a triangle and draw a right angled triangle from top left to bottom left to along horizontally to bottom right and then back diagonally up to the parent, you have what is known as the drama triangle. And the one thing we know is that within the drama triangle there are no positive results. We know there's just drama. You don't get to anything more than compromise, and you do get to bad feelings. So if our coaches are struggling with this anxiety, stress, a sense of being an imposter, a sense of being worried about being found out, one of the most valuable tools and techniques we can do is to actually help our coaches to move into that adult space, to actually, I'm okay and you're okay. And this is the conversation I have with my inner critic when I started to reframe him as an inner coach. I spent years struggling with it. And I had an absolutely brilliant coach who helped me recognize that this voice was not somebody that was manifesting miraculously out of the stratosphere, but actually was inside my head. And the first thing I was asked was, where does the voice come? He said, the voice is sitting on my left-hand shoulder. I can hear it. Is it male? Is it female? We went through this whole process. But the one thing I learned most importantly was that the use of I can't do this. I'm going to let myself down. I continually feel that I'm not going to be able to do this is not a helpful strategy. When I started to think in the we purpose-led mindset, what is my purpose here? What do I want to achieve here? What are we looking to achieve together? how can we deliver the best results we can? How can we show up as our best selves? By asking us to help the coachee to move from the I language to the we language, where we're in a win-win situation, it's hugely helpful. Actually asking them to identify where they're at is also helpful. I heard that director speak as the manipulative child. He positioned himself as the parent, the directive parent. So what was going on internally was different to what was manifesting outside. So this is one tool you can use. Can you just move on? Thanks, Nicola. Can we pick that up? Was it, sorry, I missed that one. What was the word? Entrepreneur, solo entrepreneur. I missed that. Can we, well, I'm going to open up the lines in a minute anyway, so let's just get that back on the Q&A. So I'm leaving you with these two pieces of work that you can use as a coaching session for someone if they want to play, if they want to have a go at discovering this and experimenting with what happens. Quick story. Years and years ago, after I'd done the work, I was going to a meeting in Cheshire and in England, and just as I got into the cab, I realised, I heard the voice, it came in, you're stupid, you're so forgetful. You have gone and left that yellow file that you need for the meeting on the windowsill. You were looking at it last night. And I just thought, oh, this is just ridiculous. But I acknowledged my inner coach, my inner critic, saying, thank you very much for the feedback, really appreciate it. Would have actually liked it if you'd said it in a more pleasant way, but thank you. Went upstairs into the hotel bedroom, and of course there was the folder, and I smiled. And I've got to the stage now with my inner coach that I've recognized this voice is the voice of reason and is the voice of inner coaching, if we can only allow it to shift from critic to enabler. So this last session here is very much around two parts. First of all, identifying the inner critic, helping your coachee to actually point where it's at and explain and describe what that inner critic sounds like to them. For some people, it's not verbal. For some people, there's no narrative. For some people, it's a feeling of too much adrenaline, too much cortisol, and they can't even express what they're trying to say. Their neck reddens, they blush, they stammer. For men, they become more croaky, they become speeded up, whatever it may be. That might be the less than conscious reaction. But if indeed they've got to a point of articulation with it because it's a repeated process, then actually starting to reframe that inner critic and getting to know your inner critic and actually having a bit of a play with your inner critic is so helpful. I happen to have a word that I use for my inner critic. It has a name, and I will always thank it very much and ask it to when it's finished. So if you'd just like to put up the last slide, please, Nicola. This is going from identifying and naming the inner critic. The final slide says, okay, now let's reframe the inner critic into your inner coach. And therefore, let's shift from something that is criticizing you and bringing you down to something that is enabling you as your unconscious servant. Let's start to really open that up and think about the fact that you have all these resources within you, and you just have to challenge the messages and reframe them into positive intent and action. I'll leave you with these words, and I'm going to open up the line for the last, I think, 10 minutes we have. But there is one question I did want to ask you, which is the one that I use a lot in this situation, which is question number 9. Is imposter syndrome a fear of failure or a fear of success? And why do you think that might be? That question provokes some really interesting discussion with the coaches very often, for them really start to understand what is their fear and why is this manifesting. And I think it's that classic thing, once we know what we don't know, our conscious incompetence, if you like, we can start to deal with it and actually learn a great deal from it. Thank you. I wonder if we can open up the lines.
Yeah, there is a sort of rallying against of syndromitis, isn't there? I know of some people in my wider network who aren't coaches, who are almost imposter syndrome deniers. And I just wonder what you think might be going on there. Well, I mean, two of them have even made a podcast about it, which I'm not sure was their finest hour. But you know, what do you think is going on with people? You know, we as coach might have a sense that there's something going on there, and they really rally against that.
That's a really great question for coaches to take to supervision, isn't it? And I'm mindful that on this call we have career coaches who are working for themselves, for organisations, leading up organisations, and indeed people who are within organisations and maybe people managers as well as coaches. I'll just give you a very brief response to that, and then I'd love to open the floor up. It's a great question. My experience of people in denial is that I have always chosen to take a mindset of curiosity and positive intent first, and that I will always work to protect the relationship and maintain rapport. And from then to just work my way around the environment rather than the intrinsic. Because I find that people who are in denial very often don't want to unpack that stuff, and that's fine because we can work with the environment. But other people, just love to hear what other people's thoughts are.
Yeah, I think something like that is a challenge, isn't it? Because the people that say, oh, you know, we should completely deny its existence tend to say it very confidently and have some sort of rationale for that. And as coaches, I guess, you know, our job is never to diagnose a patient and tell them this is what's going on for them. And therefore, if somebody comes along and says, I have got imposter complex and it looks like X, Y, and Z, then our job as coaches is to unpack that, to increase their awareness of themselves and their situation so that they can take responsibility for it and make changes, make positive. And so if within the time, you know, within the space that we're working with them, their belief that they have an imposter syndrome helps that, I guess I'm a bit of a pragmatist. And so, you know, let's just work with it. And actually, if through their exploration of it, they decide, oh, maybe I don't have it, and I've identified some evidence that I can now work with to overcome that myself, then again, you know, that's brilliant, but it's sort of holding it without judgment. You know, I'm not a psychotherapist. And so I wouldn't want to claim to be an expert on it, but that seems like it makes sense in the moment.
I think, yeah.
We've got a couple of hands. Should we move on to someone else?
Yeah, I just wonder whether the people who say these things about, you know, too much imposter or syndromism are those same people who actually don't like psychology as a whole. And actually, you know, those people that say it's a load of psychobabble, it's because they don't really want to know about the true inner self. And there's a fear of actually finding out too much about themselves and admitting that. So that's my theory. And so it does feel a bit like denial. Just don't want to know about it, you know. So.
Well, great point. Thanks, Lou.
May I speak? Hello, everybody. So, Karen, thank you very much for today. My question for you, it's a question, actually. I'm curious, you were talking about adrenaline, you were talking about cortisol, you were talking actually about the limbic system, but actually also you are talking about inner dialogue, which is about our prefrontal. So we're talking about coaching and about self-esteem. And what I've noticed in the group I've been were a lot of ladies saying that they have a problem comparing with others, which is a feminine thing. And in my experience, I don't compare with others, I compare with myself. So actually we are talking about this syndrome imposter when we talk about ourselves, and depends a lot what is our reference system, like in physics.
Yes.
It's about comparison. So when we are working with a customer, the question should be, what is your fear? What you are afraid of losing? Because you can lose image or you can lose surviving. I mean, maybe your job, Maybe, you know, the bread for I mean, in a career, you are losing your job. So all the time we have to talk about this. But my question for you is, why wouldn't be dependency of dopamine a reason to the syndrome system? Because when you are depending of dopamine, actually it's not enough. All the time you are starting, it doesn't matter for you if you are achieving that thing. The point is to go further, not to lose time, not to lose I don't know, life. That is another thing to come, isn't it? Dopamine, because you're mentioning adrenaline, cortisol, which is about, it's only about the limbic system, but dopamine,
it is, you're right. Yeah, and without getting into too much neuroscience, the reason I was using that was simply to say that for many, the freeze brain, the brain freeze thing that comes with all of this is very real. And you know, the one thing we know, I think it was Dopak, I can't even remember his name. The guy who was the psychologist to Michael Jackson, Deepak Chopra, who mentioned that our cells, every cell in our body is waiting for messages from the brain and responding accordingly. And I think, you know, the response, whatever the manifestation, it's actually getting to know how I deal with things and how I manage my state in situations where I get stressed. And I think you're absolutely right to raise that. Thanks. Victoria.
Hey. First of all, thank you so much for such a, well, actually mind-blowingly interesting conversation. I just wanted to add to Sarah's comment. One of the things that I noticed, especially with working with a lot of professional male, is that they don't like using terms that box them in as I am this, I'm that. And so the way I've always worked around it is I would never use a particular description. I was working with a narcissist. I would never say to him, you're a narcissist. I would never admit to being a narcissist. But in some ways, it's almost using examples of behavior that would encourage them to reframe and look at how we can, as long as we get to the outcome where their behavior is in a more positive light that they wanted to work towards, I am indifferent whether they want to call themselves a monkey rather than an imposter. I'd rather not put a name to it. And like Sam said, I'm not a psychotherapist. So with my minimum understanding of what that is, I'm in no position to actually decide what that is. And it's also a spectrum, isn't it? There's a big range of how different we are, and that's how I normally would work around that. I hope that I
love that. I think that's a really helpful insight to leave us with, not least for the fact that as soon as we start to name something, we are creating judgment.
Yes.
And we should always be curious. You're absolutely right. My experience with leaders, once you get to a point of deep rapport, is they don't want to carry on exploring it from their own perspective and their frustration if they're activists, fiery red nature. It's just tell me what this is called. And it's at that permission point that, you know, you can start to explore model or tools or whatever. But you're absolutely right. Thanks very much, Victoria.
Thank you.
Karen and Sam, I think that you've led such a, I don't know, as we were talking, it was one of those situations where everybody was describing things that I felt in my past and with my friends that I see going on all the time. I think we're all just massive victims of imposter syndrome from time to time, and for sometimes for all time, sometimes for just, you know, dipping in and dipping out of it. But I think everybody's found items in the conversation today which had a massive resonance with them. And on behalf of EMCC, I'd like to thank you so much for leading such a brilliant conversation. I was looking at some of the comments in the chat as well, and it's really, really evident that people have really taken so much from this session. Thank you so much.
Thank you everyone for all your contributions as well.